welcome to all of you to the Church of the Heavenly Rest and our chamber concert series. We are so happy to welcome back from Dallas Allison Reed, who played last night with the Philharmonic. She managed to get some rest, and now she's going to play it all for you. If you are able to make a contribution, of course it's a free concert, and all contributions are welcome and appreciated. I now hand the mic to Allison, who will be giving you lots of information about the music in your program. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for coming out, and I'm glad the weather cooperated. I was a little concerned we might have some storms out here since there are some storms at home, so I'm glad that it's good weather today here. So thank you for coming. Today I'm going to do a different program from what I played last time I was out here. These pieces all were written by harpists, and we're going to do just a very brief history of development of the harp and development of music for the harp written by harpist composers. So we're going to start off in the 1700s with Jean-Baptiste Krumpholz, and he was a Belgian composer. I'm actually going to get my little cheat sheet because it's been a while since I've given verbal notes on this. He was a Czech composer, and he came from a very musical family. All of his siblings played, his father played various instruments, and he was quite an innovator. So those of you who have been coming to the Philharmonic for years and have gotten to sit close to the harp side of the stage, you probably have noticed that at the back of the harp I have 7 pedals, and from time to time as I'm playing, I'll be moving those pedals. Those pedals are like the black keys of the piano. They're the sharps and the flats. So we have 7 because there are 7 notes in the musical scale, and each pedal has 3 positions, flat, natural, and sharp. And you're more than welcome to come up after the recital and take a look at the instrument and see how it works, because it's very complex. And it's been this way since the early 1800s is really when we kind of settled on this style as the standard for the instrument. So this music that I'll play for you actually predates that just a little bit. In Krumpholz's era, the harp was a single action, so it was like a light switch. It could be flat and natural or natural and sharp. It's just up or down with the pedal, not the double action that we have now. But Krumpholz was part of this group of innovators who were trying to help the harp play the music that was being written and keep it current with contemporary styles, and so came up with lots of innovations, including adding a swell pedal so that the back of the harp, where the sound holes are, would actually have a little door that would open and close, which would allow the sound to be either more present or almost like putting a mute on for the string instruments. He also had a pedal that would dampen the strings. It was external to the strings, and you could press that pedal and it would dampen just like on a keyboard instrument. So he was very innovative. He and his wife moved to Paris, and they actually brought one of his students with them. She was a very gifted harpist, and they both wanted to help her promote her career. Unfortunately, Krumpholz's wife died not long after they moved to Paris, and very shortly thereafter, he had a new wife who had formerly been his student. And so this is the first of harpists behaving badly, little tidbits that I have for you in this program, because as much as we have an angelic stereotype, we don't always color in the lines. And so this is the first example of this. Unfortunately, again, for him, his wife was very accomplished and actually a much more accomplished harpist than he was, and she ended up running off with somebody else, and shortly thereafter he, either on purpose or not, fell into the Seine and was drowned. So that was a very tragic end to his life, but he's a composer that probably you haven't heard of if you're not a harpist. And even the harpists that I've given this talk to don't always know all these little tidbits. So enough about that. This is a little bit from his sonata in F major, just written a few years before he passed away in 1790. Thank you so much. Well, this next one is by a French composer, Francois Joseph Noderman. We know Noderman as harpist for his etudes and exercises. He wrote lots of method books for the harp. His father was actually the harp maker to Marie Antoinette. So pretty lofty family that he came from. And so, of course, he was surrounded by harps and harpists, and also did a lot of work with trying to innovate and develop the instrument and develop music for the instrument. He was a student of Krumpholz, our previous composer, and he was the very first harp professor at the Paris Conservatory of Music, which is a place that we will revisit several times throughout this program. So this next piece is one of his better-known sonatas from his 7 progressive sonatas. Each sonata looks at a little different technical aspect. So I hope you enjoy this second sonata from the 7 progressive sonatas by Noderman. Thank you so much. Well, this next composer, Nicholas Charles Boxa, was another one of our composers who was maybe not acting in his best behavior. He was a great harpist and actually was appointed as the harpist for the Imperial Orchestra under Napoleon. So he was kind of a big deal. Unfortunately, in his background, he had committed a bunch of fraud and done a bit of thievery, and eventually, even back in that day, those stories eventually follow you and catch up with you. And so he was summarily dismissed from Napoleon's Imperial Orchestra, and he, at that point, went over to London, actually helped to found the Academy of Music in London and did a lot of work with the theaters there. But again, these scandals continue to follow him. So in 1837, he actually ran off with the wife of an opera singer. Her name was Anna Bishop, and the singer was Henry Bishop. And Anna and Nicholas Charles ran off to Australia and made their way over there. And he didn't actually live very much longer in Australia, but he had just a very colorful life, way more intrigue than you would think your normal harpist might have in their lives. And I know a lot of harpists, and I just don't know a lot of harpists who have been on the lam from their orchestras because they've been committing fraud and doing these other naughty things. So he's quite a character. The piece that I'll play for you, he also was a great teacher and wrote a lot of etudes and different styles of music, but a lot of method books. This piece comes from a collection of 3 sonatas. It's the second sonata, and I'm just going to play one movement for you. It's a pastoral, and of course, just like Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony that probably many of you saw in the Disney Fantasia, where they're all sort of running around the countryside and there's all those mythological creatures. This is sort of the setting that we think of when we think of pastoral. So there was a big movement in the 17 and 1800s to sort of romanticize country life. And so instead of thinking about how hard people are working out in the field, they would just think, oh, the flowers and the cute little sheep, and isn't it sweet? And so that's sort of the feeling behind this. So you will hear in this pastoral the horn call as they're perhaps going on a hunt, or might be trying to round up the animals. You kind of hear these very strong chords in the midst of what's otherwise a moving, kind of a moving accompanimental part. But anyway, I just thought it's a very charming piece, and we don't often get pastorals on the harp because it usually utilizes instruments like flutes and horns and things like that. So we're sort of imitating a little bit of a horn call on the harp, which I enjoy. So this is the pastoral from the second sonata by Nicholas Charles Boxa. Thank you so much. Well, our next composer, John Thomas, is a Welsh harpist. He was actually taken under the wing of Ada Lovelace. I don't know if you know that name, but you should. She's a poet and a scientist, and given credit as the first computer, what was it? Something about computer and analyzing things with computation. She was the daughter of the poet Lord Byron, a name you probably know. But Ada Lovelace was very important in the cultural scene and science and math, and also patroness of the arts. And she got to hear John Thomas as a young student, thought he had a lot of talent, and sponsored his studies in harp, which was how he was enabled to even have a career in the harp. So he started on the Welsh harp, which looks very different from this harp. It has 3 sets of strings, the note pedals, the intervals, the sharps and the flats are in between, so there's sort of a stair step, parallel strings that are ringing in harmony together, and then in between that you have all your sharps and flats. So it's a very different style of harp. And of course, when he went to the Academy of Music to study, he had to completely relearn everything that he had learned about the harp, because he was now playing a harp very similar to this style. He became an opera harpist in Italy, and in his off seasons, he would tour all over the continent and Russia, giving concerts for patrons, writing music for them. And he became actually the very first royal harpist appointed by Queen Victoria. And as part of his duties as a royal harpist, of course he would play for big affairs of state, but he was also charged to preserve the Welsh culture. And so he wrote a lot of arrangements of Welsh tunes like the Ash Grove and Eventide. So things that you would recognize. He also wrote some wonderful solo arrangements of opera arias, because he was an opera harpist, so he knew that repertoire very well as well. The royal harpist is actually a gig you can still get. Probably not any of you, and not me, because we probably weren't born in Wales. You have to be actually Welsh to get this job, and it's an appointment that most harpists have for about 2 to 4 years usually right now. But if you've seen any of the royal weddings or funerals in the last 20 years probably, you probably have seen the royal harpist, and they have a very fancy gold harp that's all carved with Welsh symbolism, and it's a very fancy gig. So anyway, it's a unique position. I wish we had a national harpist here who could tour around and write arrangements of American folk tunes. I think that would be fabulous. So maybe we'll have to think about coming up with that position. So the piece that I'll play for you is one of the most famous tunes written by John Thomas. It's not a tune that we tend to know over here, but if you are familiar with the Welsh tenor Bryn Terfel, you can hear him sing this piece. It's called Watching the Wheat. It is based on the only kind of love story we can have in music, true tragic love stories. Set in the 1720s, a young girl from a very wealthy family had a little bit of bad luck in that she fell in love with the wrong guy. And the wrong guy she fell in love with was one of the farmhands who works on her family estate. And of course, in the 1720s, you didn't marry because you liked the person, you married because your parents told you to, and you just did what they said. And so, of course, she was not allowed to pursue this relationship. She got married off to somebody her parents thought would be much more appropriate to her station, and this poor farmhand actually left town, went to go find his fortune elsewhere because he didn't want to see his beloved with some other guy. And so one night he had a dream, and in this dream the husband had died, and he thought, here's my chance. I'm going to see if she's married for money, maybe now she can marry for love. So he rushed back to this town, only to find that she was the one who was dying of a broken heart. She was so unhappily matched. It's a true story. I really wouldn't make this up. They are buried in the same little cemetery in this tiny little Welsh town. So this song is sung from the perspective of the farmhand. And when you're singing about things you feel passionate about. You want to write about things that you know. So he compares the girl to wheat. And she is sort of like the crop that he has, watched grow up and worried over and taken care of. And then at the last moment, she's carried off by somebody else. So this is Watching the Wheat by John Thomas. Thank you so much. Well, this next piece was written by a French composer, actually a Belgian composer, Alphonse Hasselmann, who is my great-grand teacher, meaning I studied with somebody who studied with him. My teacher studied with one of Hasselmann's students, whom we will also meet a little bit later. Hasselmann was a wonderful composer and a very important teacher. He taught many of the most important harpists in the first half of the 20th century. So his students included Henriette Renier, whom we'll hear from, Marcel Tournier, we'll hear from, Carlos Salcedo, my grand teacher. And he really was at the Paris Conservatory at a time when harp music was really coming into its own, the end of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. This is when we start getting, all the romantic music Fauré and Tchaikovsky ballets and Debussy, and there's just lots of music coming out for the instrument, and Hasselmann was a big part of that because he had students who were very capable players, and he himself was a great player. So the piece that I'll play for you, it's not one of his most well-known works, but it's a fun one. It's called Gitana, which means gypsy. So I think you'll hear the gypsy in this music. So Gitana by Alphonse Hasselmann. Thank you. Well, we're going to move from Hasselmann into several pieces by Hasselmann students. The first being Henriette Renier, one of also the most important harpists in the beginning of the 20th century. She was such a great harpist, and at such a young age, she actually inspired a lot of composers to write for her, including Debussy and Fauré. So we might not have as much harp music from those two had it not been for Renier. She was also a wonderful teacher and composer, arranger, did a lot of transcriptions. When Hasselmann died suddenly in 1912, she was considered for the job, actually, as the professor at the Paris Conservatory, but of course there was a little drawback in that she was a woman, and also she was Catholic. And at that time in France, in 1912, being Catholic was not the in thing to do. So she was actually passed over for that position because of her beliefs. But from what I have read of her, she was a very fiery woman who really had very strong opinions and beliefs, which I appreciate. And so she did just fine not having the Paris Conservatory hire her. The piece that I'll play for you is just a lovely, very short, characteristic piece. It's called Angelus, which of course means angels, and you'll hear the heavenly spheres resonating throughout the harp, throughout this piece. One of the special things that we can do as harpists is we can create alternative scales that don't exist on other instruments in the same way. So if you play a glissando on the harp, which of course is one of the things I just did, but I've got this crazy configuration back here. I've got a D flat and a C sharp and an F flat and a G flat, and that's not a key signature that any of us know. We're trying to repeat certain notes and then create bigger steps between other notes. So if I played that same group of notes without the pedals being in some weird configuration, then, you know, it's fine, but it's not all that exciting, and much more exciting the way it was before. And so this piece employs a lot of glissandi to create that heavenly sound, and also harmonics, which if you're a string player, you would know harmonics. Guitarists use them for tuning, but we're basically cutting off the string with the palm of our hand, just a little portion of it, and playing the top half of the string. So if the natural string sounds here, the harmonic sounds an octave higher, and it has that beautiful bell quality to it. So I think it's a very picturesque kind of piece, this soundscape that she creates in Angelus. So I hope you'll enjoy all the special effects that we can employ on the harp. Thank you. Well, our next composer, Marcel Tournier, was the one who won the Paris Conservatory position over Renier. They were, of course, rather contemporaries. Actually, she was a little bit older than he was at the time as well, so that was another thing probably working against her. Tournier was the son of a French luthier, so he made instruments similar to Naderman, who grew up in the household of a harp maker. So he understood instruments very well, and he really wanted to expand the harp repertoire. At this time, when he was teaching at the beginning of the 20th century, people like Renier and other people were doing a lot of transcriptions, borrowing music from the pianists and adapting it to the harp, but he really wanted the harp to have its own unique special sound. His goal was to expand the repertoire and did a lot of wonderful pieces in that vein. Mostly wrote for solo harp, but some chamber musics. I think he wrote an opera as well. A little interesting tidbit about him, his wife was also a harpist and a harp professor at the Paris Conservatory, but she did not play a pedal harp. She played a chromatic harp, which was something that came into vogue. It's kind of come in and out of vogue various times, but the Debussy dances, Sacre and Profane, was written as a way to showcase this chromatic harp that had no pedals and two sets of strings that kind of formed an X. So you'd have basically the white keys going one way and the black keys of the piano going the other way. And that was what she taught. So I would love to have gotten to hear some of their dinner conversations about students and music and the pros and cons of each instrument. So this piece is just a piece that I play a lot and I enjoyed. It's offrande, which means offering. So this is offrande, offering by Marcel Tournier. Thank you. Well, now we get to another one of Hasselmann's teacher, my grand teacher, Carlos Salcedo. Those of you who came to my program last year, remember I played a lot of crazy pieces by him. Here's another one. It's a little crazy, but this one paints a picture. I'll talk about a little bit about Salcedo first. He was a French harpist. He moved to the United States in the very first couple of years, the first decade of the 20th century, at the invitation of Arturo Toscanini, probably a name that you might recognize. He was the conductor for the Metropolitan Orchestra in New York City. And Salcedo came here. He became very popular, very well known as a soloist. He established the harp programs at Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, and also at what is now the Juilliard School of Music, although he did not stay there as long. Curtis was really his home base in terms of teaching, but he did establish both of those programs. And in the summer, as many people are wont to do, if you can get out of town, get out of the big city, and go out to the countryside where it's a little cooler, because of course in the first part of the 20th century, there wasn't any air conditioning, so the only way to get away from the heat was to literally run away from it. So he would go up to coastal Maine, and he bought a little house in Seal Harbor, Maine, which is just outside of where Acadia National Park is now. There was, of course, no national park there at that time. But he would teach students from all over the world out of his home, and they would stay in town with families and take lessons and do concerts, and it was a really prestigious thing to be a part of. So from his house in Seal Harbor, he could hear the waves coming up on the shore, and this, I think, inspired him to write this very programmatic piece. So this piece was written in 1927, so it's almost 100 years old, although I don't think it will sound 100 years old because it's so innovative. But this is what you hear in a sleepy little fishing town in coastal Maine in 1927. What you don't hear is, you don't hear any traffic outside, there's no TV, there's no hum of the air conditioning, so you can really hear the wind coming through the leaves. We hear the water coming up on the shore. We'll hear kind of some echoes, and we aren't really necessarily sure what those are. We'll hear some things moving around outside, and they just appear and they disappear and then they're gone. So after that little introduction, we'll go into town and there's a dance party going on. You can hear this dance music, it's very clear, and you can even hear, I'll be doing some motions like this, you'll hear kind of the swishing of the ladies' skirts as they're spinning around the dance floor. And towards the end of that section, we can even hear the dancers' feet on the floorboards. Then we'll hear the chiming of the church bells with some big chords, and that will echo with those harmonics that I showed you across the bay, and we go back out through the wind and the waves. So it's a very programmatic piece. I think it really paints a clear picture, and it's a fabulous way to show off the sound palette of the harp. So I hope you enjoy Carlos Salcedo's Song in the Night. It's a fun one, isn't it? Very unusual. Well, I'm going to close today's concert with a piece that's even more unusual, so put your seatbelts on. It's going to get a little wild in here. This last piece, written by one of Salzato's students, Pearl Chertok. She was actually the harpist for the CBS television orchestra. Used to be the big broadcast stations would have their own orchestra, and different radio stations would have their own orchestra. She was part of that for a long time, but she also got very interested in jazz. And so this last piece is lots of different sound effects, some that we didn't even explore in the last piece, and definitely some jazzy kind of chords. This comes from a suite she wrote called the Around the Clock Suite. And it is in 4 movements, and it takes you through different parts of the day and what you might be contemplating, experiencing at these different times of the day. So this is the final movement, which is actually the morning. So we already are 3 movements in, 3/4 of the day through. And we've had a very exciting day. We went out into the city, and we went to a jazz club, and there was dancing, and lots of wonderful, vibrant things happened, but it was kind of a late night. And so this movement is called The Morning After, and I just have to read what she writes just on top of the music. She has just a few sentences, and this is what she says. And I kind of feel this with the sun coming through the stained glass. I think the timing couldn't be better for this lighting. So she writes, "The alarm clock. You stretch and wish it could be ignored. Then you see the sun striking through the windows, and the day begins in clear melody." Isn't that perfect? So this is such a fun piece. There are going to be some exciting pedal slides. I'm not breaking the harp, don't worry. Even if it gets a little noisy up here, it's all part of the piece. So I hope you enjoy The Morning After from the Around the Clock Suite by Pearl Chertok. and spending this time with me and taking time out of your busy weekend or just the last little bits of time you have to yourself. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much to Tom and our pastor and everyone in the church for having us, the sound people and everyone who's helped me get set up here. And I just really appreciate you coming out to support the music here, and also all of you who came to the Philharmonic. We really appreciate your support as well. If you have any questions or just want to take a look at the harp, the music, any of that, please feel free to come up. Don't be shy. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.